but the hitchhiker's warning. Rajesh had been driving for hours, the dark stretch of road unfolding in front of him like an endless abyss. The headlights of his old car carved a narrow path through the thick fog, barely illuminating the dense jungle that bordered the highway. The engine hummed steadily, but the eerie silence of the night, broken only by the occasional screech of the tires on the wet road, weighed heavily on his mind. His phone had died hours ago, and he was completely cut off from the world, alone with his thoughts. He had received the call earlier in the evening, and the urgency in his mother's voice had left him no choice but to make the long journey back to the village. The family emergency wasn't something that could wait until morning. He couldn't afford to waste time, even if the road was treacherous and the hour late. The drive would take him through remote areas where the village roads barely met the highways, but he had made the trip countless times before. Still, tonight felt different. The air was thicker, heavier, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Rajesh glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 2:42 a.m. It felt like he had been driving for days. His eyes were starting to droop, and his thoughts kept drifting. The lights ahead flickered, casting brief flashes of light across the dense forest on either side. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their limbs creaking in the wind. He pressed his foot harder on the accelerator, urging the car to go faster. If he didn't get to the village soon, he feared it would be too late. The road wound sharply to the left, and Rajesh instinctively slowed down. As he navigated the curve, something caught his eye in the dim glow of the headlights. A figure, small and thin, stood at the edge of the road. At first, Rajesh thought it was some sort of mirage, perhaps a trick of the fog, his tired mind playing tricks on him. But then the figure moved, slowly and deliberately, stepping out from behind the trees. His heart skipped a beat. A woman. She was dressed in a bright red sari, her long black hair cascading down her back, hiding her face in a way that felt strange. The red of her sari seemed almost out of place against the dark, muted surroundings. It was a striking contrast, almost as if she was deliberately drawing attention to herself. Rajesh's instincts screamed at him to keep driving. It wasn't uncommon for travelers to find hitchhikers in the middle of nowhere, but something about this woman felt wrong. The eerie silence that surrounded her was unsettling, as though she wasn't quite part of this world. But as he drove closer, he couldn't bring himself to ignore her. He had heard too many stories of people who passed by those in need and later regretted it. The woman raised her head slightly, revealing just enough of her face to show her pale, gaunt features. Her eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to bore into him as he slowed the car down to a stop. She came closer, moving with unnatural grace, her feet barely touching the ground. Her presence felt almost dreamlike, as if she wasn't really there but somehow occupying the same space. Rajesh rolled down the window, trying to ignore the knot that had suddenly formed in his stomach. The woman leaned in, her breath fogging up the glass as she whispered, "Please, can you give me a ride to the next town? It's very late, and I have no one." He hesitated, staring at her. Her voice was soft but urgent, carrying a hint of desperation that tugged at something deep inside him. He wanted to say no, to drive away and forget he had ever seen her, but something in her eyes held him captive. "Are you okay?" Rajesh asked cautiously, his voice betraying a sense of unease. She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm fine. I just need to get to the town," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper now. Against his better judgment, Rajesh nodded. "All right, get in." The woman didn't speak as she slid into the back seat, and Rajesh immediately felt a coldness settle over him. The air in the car seemed to shift, becoming dense, as though it was charged with something foreign, something that shouldn't belong in the world of the living. He began driving again, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The The fog had thickened, the road barely visible through the white mist that surrounded them. He tried to focus on the road ahead, but his mind kept drifting back to the strange woman in the back seat. She hadn't said a word since getting in. Rajesh stole a quick glance at the rearview mirror. The woman was staring out the window, her long black hair obscuring her face entirely. But then, Rajesh froze. In the reflection of the rearview mirror, the woman's face was smiling, but her actual face, what little he could see of it, was emotionless. Still, her lips pressed together in a thin, unnerving line. A chill ran down his spine. He looked back at the road, forcing himself to concentrate. It had to be a trick of the mirror, he told himself. Maybe the reflection was simply showing something he hadn't noticed before. But the smile, it seemed wrong, so terribly wrong. Rajesh glanced back again. The woman's smile had only grown wider in the reflection, though her face remained as cold and empty as ever. "Stop smiling," he muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. The woman's voice broke the silence, a low whisper that sent shivers crawling up his spine. "Whatever happens, don't stop the car, no matter what you hear or see." Rajesh felt a knot form in his stomach, his heart hammering in his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask what she meant, but before he could get the words out, the sound of loud banging erupted from the trunk. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to break free from the confines of the small space. Bang, bang, bang. The noise echoed in the still night, the sound reverberating through the car, shaking it to its core. Rajesh's eyes widened in terror, and his hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice strained with panic. The woman's voice was calm, too calm, almost detached. "I told you not to stop. Don't listen to it. Don't stop." The banging continued, louder now, with a frenetic energy, as though whatever was in the trunk had lost all sense of control. Rajesh's mind raced. He was paralyzed, torn between the fear of what might happen if he kept driving, and the dread of what might be waiting for him if he stopped. He could feel sweat beginning to bead on his forehead as his foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, driving faster and faster into the night. And then, the banging stopped. Just as suddenly as it had started, the trunk was silent. The entire car seemed to hold its breath. But then came something far worse. A low, cruel laugh. It echoed through the car, filling the space with an oppressive sense of foreboding. The laugh was hollow, devoid of warmth, as if it belonged to something that shouldn't exist. It was the sound of madness, of something ancient and malevolent. Rajesh's eyes darted to the rearview mirror again, and this time, there was no reflection. The back seat was empty. His heart skipped a beat. The woman was gone. His breath caught in his throat as he slammed his foot on the brakes, swerving the car to the side of the road. He wasn't sure if he had even planned to stop, but he couldn't drive any further. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and he needed answers. His eyes scanned the empty back seat, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But it was useless. The phone was dead, and he had no signal. His mind spun in a blur of confusion and fear. And then, in the midst of the silence, he saw it. A small, bloodied note resting on the seat. It was folded neatly, as if it had been placed there with care. He hesitated before picking it up, his fingers trembling as he unfolded it. The note was short, the writing jagged and erratic. "Thank you for the ride. You're next." The words burned into his mind, and a wave of dread washed over him. The woman, whoever she was, whatever she hadn't been human. She was something else, something that should never have crossed his path. He could feel her presence now, lurking somewhere in the darkness, watching him. Rajesh's hands shook uncontrollably as he threw the car into gear and sped off into the fog, hoping, praying that whatever had been chasing him would leave him alone. But deep down, he knew it was already too late. And as the fog swallowed him whole, he heard that chilling laugh once more, echoing in the distance. The howling shadows. The sun had barely set when Amit, Priya and Varun made their way out of the mountains, their backpacks still heavy with the remnants of their weekend trek. They had climbed, hiked, and laughed their way through the jagged peaks, marveling at the beauty of the wilderness. Now, as they drove back to the city, the roads stretched endlessly before them, winding through dense jungle. The glow of their headlights barely made a dent in the surrounding darkness, and the trees on either side of the narrow highway loomed like silent giants, their branches swaying in the night breeze. Priya yawned from the back seat. "I'm so glad we decided to take the shortcut. I can't wait to get home," she said, trying to keep her voice upbeat despite the exhaustion that settled in her bones. Varun, who was sitting next to her, grinned. "Shortcut? You mean the route that's more likely to get us lost in the jungle and eaten by wild animals?" he teased, nudging her playfully. "Don't jinx it," Amit the driver replied with a chuckle. "We'll be fine. It's just a little darker than usual tonight. That's all." Priya glanced out the window. The jungle seemed unusually quiet. Too quiet, even for this time of night. The sounds of crickets, birds, and the wind rustling through the leaves were absent. Instead, there was a heavy stillness in the air, as if the world itself was holding its breath. As they continued down the winding road, the trees began to close in on them, their twisted branches clawing at the sides of the car as if trying to pull them into the depths of the forest. The fog had rolled in without warning, thick and damp, seeping into the car and making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. "All right, this is creepy," Varun muttered, his joking tone fading as the silence deepened. "It feels like we're driving into a haunted forest or something." Amit smiled nervously. "It's fine. We're almost through it. Just stay alert." They drove on in silence for a few moments, the only sound the soft hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of the car over bumps in the road. And then, suddenly they heard it. A low, guttural howl. It started distant, barely perceptible over the noise of the car, but it quickly grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was something else. Something human, but distorted, twisted into a noise that sent chills up their spines. The hairs on Priya's arms stood on end. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Amit glanced around, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Probably a wild animal, just sounded strange, that's all." But as they drove further into the forest, the howling grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to circle the car, moving from one side to the other, as if whatever was making the noise was closing in on them. The sound was so close now that it felt as though it was coming from the trees themselves. Priya's heart raced. "Amit, are you sure it's just an animal?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. Amit nodded, but his eyes were wide, scanning the darkness. I'm not sure," he admitted, his voice shaking slightly. "But stay calm. We're fine." Varun, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up, his voice cracked. "That doesn't sound like any animal I've ever heard." Priya's fingers dug into the seat, her breath coming faster. The howling had intensified, now punctuated by something else, a kind of scraping sound, like claws dragging across the bark of a tree. Then, without warning, the car's engine sputtered and died. Amit slammed his palm against the steering wheel. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. The car jerked to a halt in the middle of the road, the headlights flickering as though they too were struggling to stay on. The eerie howling continued, now almost deafening in its intensity. "Great," Amit cursed, unbuckling his seatbelt and opening the door. "I'll check under the hood. Stay here." He stepped out into the oppressive darkness, and the moment the door closed behind him, the jungle fell deathly silent. The howling stopped. The wind, which had been whispering through the trees, ceased as well. Everything went still, unnaturally still. It was as though the world had gone mute, holding its breath in anticipation. Priya and Varun exchanged uneasy glances. The air felt thick, suffocating, pressing against their lungs. Priya felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. "Amit, hurry up," she whispered, her voice shaking. "This isn't right." Varun shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Yeah, this place is messed up," he muttered, his voice thin with fear. "Something's wrong." And then they saw it. Movement in the trees. Shadows, dark and fluid, slithering between the trunks of the towering trees. They were not the shadows of leaves or branches. These were different. They moved like something alive, something that could think, could choose where to go. Priya's breath caught in her throat as one of them came closer, its shape distorted and unnatural. The shadow flickered and shifted, melting into another form as it passed. I think we should go," Priya whispered urgently. Her heart was pounding in her chest now, and the fear gnawing at her insides felt primal, uncontrollable. But before Varun could answer, a scream shattered the silence. "Amit!" Priya shouted, her voice rising in panic. She threw open the door, rushing to the front of the car, her heart pounding in her chest. "Amit, where are you?" The darkness swallowed her cries, and the shadows in the trees seemed to lean in closer, watching. Amit's scream had been high-pitched, desperate, cut off abruptly, as if something had grabbed him and yanked him away. Priya's legs trembled, but she forced herself to move forward, stepping out into the pitch-black jungle. "Don't go!" Varun called after her, but his voice was weak, filled with fear. "It's not safe. We need to stay in the car." But Priya didn't listen. She had to find him. She had to know what had happened to Amit. The forest was eerily quiet now. The shadows moved, shifting in the corner of her vision. But whenever she looked directly at them, they disappeared. The further she ventured, the more the trees closed in around her, their branches clawing at her clothes as if trying to hold her back. It felt like the forest itself was alive, like it was trying to keep her from finding the truth. The trail of muddy footprints was easy to follow in the soft earth, but the deeper she went, the more unnatural the marks appeared. The prints twisted and curled, as though Amit had been dragged off by something. Priya's breath hitched as she reached a clearing, the air thick with an unsettling heaviness. And then she saw him. Amit was standing in the center of the clearing, facing her. But something was wrong. His body was still, and his posture was unnervingly stiff. His head tilted slightly to the side, his eyes black as coal, without a trace of recognition in them. A smile, a wide, twisted grin, spread across his face, but it was not his smile. It was something else, something alien. "Priya," he said, his voice a distorted echo of what it should have been. Her heart stopped. It wasn't Amit. "It's not Amit," she whispered, her voice trembling. The words escaped her like a prayer, a warning. "It's pretending to be him." She turned to run, but before she could take another step, the backseat door of the car creaked open behind her. The figure of Amit, no, the thing that wore his face, climbed into the car, its movements jerky and unnatural. It smiled again, its mouth stretching wider than a human's ever should, and its black eyes glistened in the faint light of the car's flickering headlights. Priya ran back to the car, her legs shaking beneath her. But the moment she reached the driver's seat, the engine roared to life on its own. The car started moving, jerking forward with frightening speed, as though some unseen force had taken control. "Varun!" Priya screamed. "We have to get out!" But Varun was no longer there. The car was driving faster and faster now, weaving between the trees as the shadows closed in around them, moving in the periphery, waiting for the right moment to strike. The jungle swallowed their cries, and as the car sped into the night, the howl of the forest rose again, louder and more insistent than ever. It wasn't an animal's cry. It was the sound of something far worse. The endless highway. Vivek had always been a night owl, and as a long-haul trucker, he had gotten used to the solitude of the highway. For years, he had driven through the night, hauling freight from one city to the next, the hum of the truck's engine and the monotonous stretch of asphalt keeping him company. But this highway, the one cutting through the dense forest, had a reputation. The locals talked about it in hushed whispers, about the strange disappearances, the ghostly apparitions, the odd sounds that filled the night air. They called it the haunted route, and stories of truckers who'd driven through only to never return were common in the small towns near its entrance. But Vivek wasn't one to buy into folklore and superstitions. He had driven this route countless times, and he had always laughed off the stories. Ghosts? He wasn't afraid of that kind of thing. A trucker's life was built on practicality, and superstition had no place in his world. Tonight, like so many other nights, he was alone behind the wheel. The vast expanse of road stretched out in front of him, surrounded on both sides by thick forest. The trees pressed close to the edge of the asphalt, their silhouettes jagged and looming in the pale light of the truck's headlights. A light drizzle had begun to fall, adding a soft hiss to the sound of the tires skimming across the wet road. The clock on the dashboard read 2:45 a.m. Vivek yawned, reaching for his coffee thermos. The steaming liquid burned his tongue as he took a long sip, wiping the drops from his lips. He'd been on the road for hours, but the familiar sound of his playlist blasting through the speakers kept him awake. It was a long haul, and the night was still young. Just another night, he muttered to himself, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel in time to the music. He felt his eyelids droop for a second before he forced them open, shaking his head to stay alert. But then, exactly at 3 a.m., something strange happened. The radio, which had been playing his favorite tunes without issue, suddenly crackled with static. The music cut off, and for a moment, there was just the sound of the truck's engine and the patter of rain on the windshield. Vivek frowned, reaching for the radio knobs to adjust the volume, but instead of the usual smooth sound of a song starting back up, there was nothing but static. He twisted the knobs, trying to find a station, but the crackling only grew louder, more intense. It was as though the very air around him was being torn apart. Annoyed, he slapped the dashboard, hoping to jolt the radio back to life, but nothing worked. The static remained, buzzing in his ears like an irritating insect. "Great," he muttered. "That's just what I need." He let the truck roll on, his focus shifting to the road ahead. The rain was coming down harder now, and he squinted through the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up. But something wasn't right. The trees along the road, he had seen them before. In fact, he had passed the same crooked tree and broken milestone about 20 minutes ago. Frowning, Vivek glanced at the clock. It was now 3:15 a.m. He had been on this stretch of road for well over an hour, but nothing looked different. The road twisted and turned through the dense forest, the trees stretching endlessly in every direction. He shook his head, trying to shake off the creeping sense of unease. He couldn't have gotten lost. He had driven this route so many times, it was practically second nature to him. But as he passed the crooked tree and broken milestone again, the same familiar landmarks that seemed to appear at the exact same spots, an unsettling feeling crawled down his spine. Something was off. It was like time had stopped, and he was stuck in some kind of loop. The truck's GPS sat on the dashboard, its screen blank, like it had frozen. He pressed the button to reset it, but the screen remained dark. "Okay, this is getting weird," he said aloud, his voice low and tense. He pulled over to the side of the road, his headlights slicing through the dark as he stepped out of the truck. The rain hit him like a cold slap to the face, but he didn't care. He walked around to the front of the truck, checking the road signs, looking for something that would tell him he was on the right track. The road was empty. The air felt thick, heavy, and strangely oppressive. He could barely hear anything over the sound of the rain and his own breathing. And then, in the distance, he saw them. At first, they looked like shadows. Dark, indistinct shapes standing on the road, just beyond the glow of the headlights. Vivek squinted, trying to make out any details, but they were too far away, too obscured by the fog and the rain. He walked closer, his boots squelching in the mud. As he drew nearer, the shapes took on more definition. They were figures, people, or what looked like people, but they stood completely still, facing him. Their features were obscured by the mist and darkness. But Vivek could see that they weren't moving. Not even a twitch. They were like statues, perfectly still and silent. His heart began to pound in his chest. There was something wrong about them. He couldn't put his finger on it, but every instinct screamed at him to get back in the truck and drive away. He was about to turn around when the figures moved. Slowly, they turned their heads toward him. The movement was unnerving, almost unnatural, and it sent a cold shiver down his spine. "Hey!" Vivek shouted, his voice growing shaky. He wasn't sure if he was angry or terrified, but he honked his horn, the sharp blast echoing in the silence. "Move! Get off the road!" But they didn't flinch. They didn't react in any way. They just stood there, staring at him with faces obscured by the fog. It was as though they couldn't hear him, or worse, didn't care. Vivek's pulse quickened. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, taking a step back. That's when one of the figures moved. It was so fast, it was almost as though it materialized right in front of him. One moment, it was standing on the side of the road, and the next, it was inches from his face. Vivek's heart stopped. The figure was no longer obscured by the fog. Its face was a pale, twisted mask, a grotesque visage of empty eye sockets, and a mouth stretched into a grin that could have been carved into its skull. It was like a human form, but not. The bones of its face were visible, the skin stretched thin over the jagged edges. It looked like something that had been dead for years, but was somehow still walking the earth. Vivek froze, his breath catching in his throat. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure reached for the truck door with a skeletal hand, its fingers elongated and twisted, scraping the metal as it tried to open the door. His heart raced, panic rising in his chest. "Get away from me!" Vivek screamed, stumbling backward. He fumbled for the truck's door handle, throwing himself inside as fast as he could. He slammed the door shut and locked it, his hands shaking. He floored the gas pedal, throwing the truck into motion, tearing down the road at breakneck speed. The truck lurched forward, and for a moment, it felt like the shadows were receding behind him. But as he turned the corner, he saw them again. The figures were everywhere now, standing across the road, blocking his path. No matter how fast he drove, no matter how hard he pressed the accelerator, the figures remained ahead of him, multiplying with every passing second. They didn't move, but their eyes followed him, their hollow sockets boring into him as though they were watching his every move. The whispers started then, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. They were coming from the figures, from the trees, from the very air around him. "You can't leave," the whispers echoed, a chorus of voices, low and distorted. Vivek's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white. He glanced in the rearview mirror, his heart in his throat, but there was no escape. The figures were everywhere, their forms becoming clearer, their faces more grotesque. They were not human. Not anymore. The truck's engine roared, its tires screaming against the asphalt as he sped faster, but it was futile. The road stretched on, and the figures kept appearing, no matter which direction he turned. Every twist and turn led him back to the same place, the same crooked tree, the same broken milestone, the same nightmare. Vivek was trapped. For what felt like hours, he drove through the endless night, the truck hurtling down the road with no end in sight. The figures multiplied, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. He was surrounded, suffocated by their presence, and the closer he got to the figures, the colder the air became. At 6 a.m., the truck was found, abandoned on the side of the road, its engine still running, the doors wide open. There was no sign of Vivek. The only clue left behind was a handprint burned into the driver's seat, a handprint that didn't belong to him. The figures, whatever they were, had taken him, and the highway, as always, continued on. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed these spine-chilling stories, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more terrifying tales. We've got plenty more horror stories coming your way, and you won't want to miss them. Stay safe out there, and remember, the darkness is always just around the corner. And if any of you want to send us horror story for showing up here in this channel, please send it to our official email. We have given it in description.